It was the winter of 1889. For nearly 2 decades, George Paxton Young had been the philosophy professor at the University of Toronto. He had brought the university a measure of renown with his publications on advanced topics in logic and mathematics, and he had endeared himself to more than a generation of students with his talents as a teacher. But now, on the 20th of February, he suffered a massive stroke, which left him partially paralyzed and without speech. A week later, he passed away, leaving open perhaps the most prestigious philosophical chair in Canada. Although no one believed it would be easy to replace Young, no one knew how profoundly the process would challenge the Toronto community as a whole. A field of over 20 applicants was soon distilled to just 2. One, a Torontonian named James Gibson Hume, had been a favored undergraduate of Young's and had just completed a master's degree at Harvard. The other was an American named James Mark Baldwin. Baldwin would later become one of the most significant psychologists in North America, but then he had just earned his doctorate at Princeton and was a relatively unknown professor at an obscure Presbyterian college in Illinois. The matter of deciding between Hume and Baldwin would rapidly descend into an unseemly battle, not only involving university administrators, but also the highest levels of the Ontario government, the popular press, and the public at large. It would become intertwined with the contentious questions of nationalism, religion, and the place of science in education. The impact of the choice ultimately made would reverberate not only through the university and through Canada's educational establishment more broadly for decades to come, but it would also unexpectedly ripple through the nascent discipline of experimental psychology, just then gathering steam in Canada's enormous southern neighbor, the United States of America. Sitting on the northern shore of Lake Ontario, Toronto was, in 1889, a bustling port of about 180,000. Its population had nearly doubled over the previous decade, making it about the size of Detroit or Milwaukee, but its residents did not consider themselves to be like their American counterparts.
I think Toronto was known as a Victorian city 13 years ago, I guess it would be, and it was strongly Protestant, and I think many people prided themselves that Toronto still kept the Sabbath, that there was so few bars in the city compared to American cities.
Toronto, then as now, was the capital of Ontario, the largest province in Canada. Ontario was ruled by Oliver Mowat, a Liberal who had held the Premier's job for 17 years. In the national capital of Ottawa, Conservative John A. Macdonald had been the Prime Minister of Canada for 17 of the previous 22 years. Political controversy often arose from linguistic and religious conflict. Louis Riel's Northwest Rebellion and subsequent execution were only 4 years in the past. The great issue of the day was the Jesuits' Estates Act, a bill passed by Quebec's National Assembly that paid the Catholic Order $160,000 in compensation for lands that had been taken by the British government when the French territory had been conquered over a century earlier. English Protestants were predictably outraged at what they viewed as papist interference in Canadian affairs. The opposition was led by a group of English Canadian nationalists that first arose in Ontario in the late 1860s. From the start, they fought against any concession to Canada's French-speaking and Catholic minorities. The movement was particularly active in Toronto.
They formed themselves into a political party called Canada First, which of course the very name exemplifies their central belief, namely that Canada had to regard itself as an equal of Britain and the United States. They were especially dominant in the University of Toronto because the Senate, which was the governing body of the university at that time, had 15 seats on it that were elected by the graduates. And the 15 who were elected were all Canada Firsters.
The Canada First Party had collapsed in the 1870s, but its remnants were still able to exert some influence over political matters in the 1880s. These nativists, as they were often called, did not limit their attention to issues of national scope. They scrutinized even the affairs of the university for implications they might hold for the nativist agenda. For instance, in the month just prior to George Paxton Young's death, a controversy erupted over the appointment of one William John Alexander to the chair of English literature. Although Alexander was a Canadian, he was not from Ontario, and he had earned his degrees in Europe and the United States. The opposition to his hiring, which set the stage for the battle over who would replace Young, was led by the nativists.
Their demands were that everyone hired should be a Canadian, and Canadian trained too. They didn't even like to have Canadians go to Britain and get a degree and come back, as Alexander exemplifies. What they wanted was local products, and that was it. And then some of them, especially the Toronto graduates, developed the idea that not only did they want Canadians, but they wanted Torontonians who had been educated at the university.
The issue of the appointment of Alexander quickly became a matter of heated public debate in the local press. The main object of nativist criticism was Sir Daniel Wilson, president of the university. Beginning on the 9th of February, Wilson was attacked in a series of anonymous letters to the largest of Toronto's newspapers, the traditionally Tory Daily Mail.
Friends and graduates of the university would like to know how it is that no man of Canadian education, and especially no graduate of Toronto, need apply for vacant chairs. At Toronto University they have found closed doors and a malignant and steady opposition. From whom? From the head of University College. This is fact.
The letter was pseudonymously signed Torontonensis, slightly misspelled, a Latin term meaning from Toronto. Wilson was a Scotsman from Edinburgh, a respected scholar of history, of literature, of art, and of British archaeology. He is said to have coined the term prehistory, and to have taught the first course in anthropology anywhere. From the day he had joined the Toronto faculty more than 35 years before, he had worked tirelessly to improve the university's reputation. He had seen earlier administrations reject the applications of luminaries such as physicist John Tyndall and naturalist Thomas Henry Huxley for reasons of patronage, and he was determined not to let similar errors occur on his watch, no matter the political cost. James Mark Baldwin later said of him that,
"He had the suavest manners and the most persuasive of ways, except when he was crossed. Then he became the stubborn and aggressive Scot."
Wilson, who had indeed been crossed, shot back at his anonymous critic Torontonensis.
"It is to be regretted that this amiable gentleman withholds his name. Charges of malignant betrayal of so responsible a trust should surely be made over their author's own signature, so that we may be quite sure he is not modestly ascribing his own virtues to another."
The anonymous author of the letter attacking Wilson even tried to bring the greatly respected Professor Young in on the side of the nativists.
It should be generally known that Professor Young, at the time of his appointment, barely escaped being sacrificed in favor of the claims of some Scotch nobody. What does the public of the province think of this policy of the president of the provincial university? Torontonensis.
The tactic was to no avail, however. Young, himself a Scotsman, educated at Edinburgh like Wilson, publicly defended the university president. Young's intervention did not end the spat, however. 3 days later, the Mail published a second letter by Torontonensis, as well as one by a Torontonensis No. 2. Wilson responded again the next day, but his participation seemed only to fan the flames. A half-dozen letters appeared over the next few days, until the editor of the Mail announced he would publish no more correspondence on the topic. In the midst of the flap, Young had his fatal stroke. Speculation immediately turned to who Wilson might endorse as Young's replacement. An anonymous letter to the Mail, and an editorial in the Toronto paper most sympathetic to nativism, The World, simultaneously suggested a secret plot on Wilson's part to bring in Cornell philosopher Jacob Gould Sherman to replace Young, and then, upon Wilson's own impending retirement, place Sherman in the presidency of the university. Sherman was a Canadian from Prince Edward Island, but like Alexander, he had committed the unpardonable sin in the eyes of the nativists of having gone abroad for his advanced degrees. Wilson had tried to bring him to Toronto as professor of history in 1880, but Sherman had chosen to return to the Maritimes, teaching English at Acadia and Dalhousie in Nova Scotia for 6 years before moving on to a philosophy position at Cornell in upstate New York. The critics were predictably brutal about the possibility of his coming to Toronto.
If Dr. Sherman were a man of exceptional genius or attainments, there might be some excuse, but there are plenty of men among Toronto graduates head and shoulders above him. If, through the apathy of public opinion, or by the aid of political intrigue, President Wilson bequeaths to Dr. Sherman his own position at Toronto, the university will have received a blow from which it will probably never rally. Argus.
We do not think that Mr. Sherman is either the man or the scholar for the place, and that what tells most against him is the manner and the methods he is employing to accomplish his aim. The World.
The Toronto tempest about Sherman continued on, and was even raised in the Ontario Parliament. The critics would prove to be drastically wrong about Sherman's potential. He would soon become president of Cornell and found the prestigious Philosophical Review. He would later work as a top American diplomat, finally serving as the U.S. ambassador to Germany. It is not known whether Sherman wanted the Toronto position, or whether he was affected by the public protest over the mere rumor of his hiring, but he never formally applied for the job. As winter turned to spring, the press battles over Young's replacement waned perceptibly. In part, they were overshadowed by a new controversy concerning the publication of some critical remarks about Toronto's admission standards made by Principal George Monroe Grant of Queen's University, a private Presbyterian school located about 150 miles east of Toronto. More important, however, public criticism of President Wilson could only have so much effect, because the actual power to hire professors lay with the Liberal Premier, Oliver Mowat. Mowat was generally a moderate and a pragmatist, but when the Canada First political party collapsed, many of its former members, the nativists, found shelter in Mowat's Liberal Party. Mowat knew they would have to be appeased if he was to stay in power, and he was facing an election in just over a year's time. Two members of Mowat's cabinet were known to have strong nativist sympathies. One was the provincial secretary, John Morrison Gibson. Gibson had only been raised from the backbenches a few months before, but brought with him popular renown as a soldier. The other nativist member of the cabinet was the government's point man when it came to university hirings, Minister of Education George William Ross. Powerful as they were, Ross and Gibson were not the only tools the nativists had at their disposal. In addition, there was the politically powerful yet sometimes erratic university chancellor, Edward Blake. Blake had briefly served as Premier of Ontario in the early 1870s, as Federal Justice Minister in the late 1870s, and as leader of the Federal Liberal Party through most of the 1880s. Despite these successes, his relationship with his party was often rocky. He threatened to jump to the Canada First Party in 1874, only to quickly backtrack. He frequently broke ranks with his party publicly, even while in government. Many did not trust him, but the nativists often claimed him as their own. In addition to Blake, several of the leading members of the University Senate were vocal nativists as well. In short, with support in the provincial cabinet room, in the chancellor's office, and in the University Senate chamber, things looked promising for the nativists this time around. It was not until the middle of June that Ross finally advertised the Toronto philosophy position. In addition to advertisements in some Canadian newspapers, he purchased small spaces in The Athenaeum, an English magazine catering to an educated readership, and in its American equivalent, The Nation. Neither ad included a wealth of information about the position. The American version did not even include an address to which applications could be submitted. If the small, uninformative ads were a tactic on Ross's part to discourage foreign applications, it did not work. Of the 20-some inquiries and applications that were received, at least 5 were from England and 8 from the United States. The most prominent inquiry came from the British philosopher James Sully, author of a popular textbook on psychology. Sully's query was never followed up by a formal application, however. The most prominent American applicant was said by many at the time to be the Reverend Edward John Hamilton, a professor from Hamilton College in upstate New York. Hamilton was a follower of the Scottish intuitionist school of thought, like many older American philosophers of the day. He had written a textbook, The Human Mind, published 6 years before. Education Minister Ross, however, ruled out the hiring of a clergyman at the beginning of the process, and at 55 years of age, many seem to have viewed Hamilton as being too old for the position. Another potentially promising American applicant was George Holmes Howison, professor of philosophy at the University of California. Howison was a longtime acquaintance of William James, who wrote Howison a letter of reference. Howison was not a clergyman, but at 55 years of age, like Hamilton, he too seems to have been regarded as being too old for the job. From within Canada came an application from James Seth, a Scotsman who had filled the position at Dalhousie left open when Jacob Gould Sherman had moved from there to Cornell. Seth's older brother, Andrew, was well known in philosophical circles, and the younger Seth had just published an article in the prestigious British journal Mind. Although Seth was regarded well by some on the informal hiring committee, his Scottish origins ultimately seemed to have doomed his application to the sidelines. In the end, it was 2 men who completed their applications just at the deadline who would become the main contenders for Young's chair, James Gibson Hume and James Mark Baldwin. Hume was a graduate of Toronto, where he had claimed the gold medal in mental science and in classics.
He became a protege of George Paxton Young, who was his principal teacher, of course, in the 3rd and 4th year. And Young recommended that he go to Johns Hopkins to train, Hume says, as an experimental psychologist, but we only have Hume's view of this. Young wrote to a professor of mathematics at Johns Hopkins and got Hume admitted.
Hume began his graduate work under the supervision of G. Stanley Hall, founder of the first experimental psychology research laboratory in the United States and of the American Journal of Psychology. Hume did well under Hall, earning himself a fellowship for the following year. He was not able to take advantage of the award, however, because Hall was just then moving to take up the presidency of Clark University, leaving the philosophy department and the psychology laboratory at Hopkins closed behind him. Rather than traveling with Hall to Clark, Hume enrolled at Harvard to complete his master's degree. Although he took courses with the luminaries of the department, Francis Bowen, William James, and Josiah Royce, he formed his strongest attachment with a theologian named Francis Greenwood Peabody, an advocate of the social gospel and a fervent prohibitionist. Hume had been an active temperance advocate since his teens, and he wrote a paper on the topic for one of Peabody's courses. He also wrote a paper on the so-called Indian problem, claiming that relations with natives were better in Canada because the government there had never broken a treaty with the First Nations. Apparently Peabody approved, giving the paper an A-. Hume was finishing his master's degree and was about to embark on doctoral studies when word came of Young's death. He would later claim that Young had promised him a position at Toronto after he had acquired some training in experimental psychology. Ironically, he seems to have done no laboratory work at either Johns Hopkins or Harvard. This apparent shortcoming, however, did not prevent Toronto nativists from quickly seizing upon Hume as the ideal replacement for Young. Nor apparently did the fact that Hume had not yet even begun work on his Ph.D., nor that he did not yet have a single publication to his name. Hume's application had impressive support. It contained testimonials from important figures such as Clark University President G. Stanley Hall, Johns Hopkins President Daniel Coit Gilman, and Harvard philosophers Josiah Royce and William James. All were very complimentary. James, however, found himself in the difficult position of having to write testimonials for both Hume and California professor George Howison. Forced to make a choice, he favored Howison because of his long experience. Of the younger man, he wrote,
Mr. Hume is, of course, more of an unknown quantity. He is one of the 3 most promising students of philosophy whom I have had in 15 years' experience at Harvard College, and I hope and expect a brilliant future for him.
Perhaps trying to play up his relationship with James, Hume wrote in his application that the Harvard professor had asked to publish in his forthcoming textbook a paper Hume had written on sensation. The book was, of course, James's monumental Principles of Psychology, but Hume's paper never appeared in it. James included instead the work of another of his students, Edmund Burke de la Barre, who would go on to found the psychology laboratory at Brown University. James Mark Baldwin was born in South Carolina during the Civil War and raised during the Reconstruction. Thanks to a family connection, he traveled north to receive the bulk of his education in New Jersey. He graduated from Princeton College, then a Presbyterian school, a student of the famed Scottish realist James McCosh. McCosh, who was also Princeton's president, arranged for Baldwin to study in Germany for a year after his bachelor's degree. Baldwin attended lectures in several cities, spending some of his time in Leipzig, working in Wilhelm Wundt's famous experimental psychology laboratory. Upon returning to Princeton, he began work on his Ph.D. He had wanted to write his dissertation on Spinoza's philosophy, but McCosh insisted that he devote it to a refutation of materialism. He did so, but also published an article on Spinoza. In addition, he produced a number of articles on the new psychology. Before completing his doctorate, Baldwin took up a position at Lake Forest College, a small Presbyterian school near Chicago with strong connections to Princeton. While there, he finished his dissertation, published the first volume of his first textbook on psychology, and married the daughter of the head of the Princeton Theological Seminary, William Henry Greene. Lake Forest was too parochial a place for a man of Baldwin's ambitions, however, and so he was open to new opportunities elsewhere. When Young's position opened, a network of connections between Toronto and Princeton went into action to help Baldwin land the job.
There was many connections between the two, including that a few graduates from the University of Toronto, or specifically I think even Knox College, were professors or in leadership at Princeton University, namely, and above all, Francis Patton.
Francis Landy Patton was the man who had just succeeded McCosh as president of Princeton. In the 1860s, he had attended the Presbyterian seminary affiliated with the University of Toronto, Knox College. Young had taught at Knox prior to moving to the university, and Patton was reputed to have been one of his best students there. Moreover, one of the most promising students of Baldwin's powerful new father-in-law, William Henry Greene, had recently taken up a position at Toronto in Oriental languages. His name was James Frederick McCurdy. Between McCurdy, Greene, and Patton, Baldwin was made aware of the opening at Toronto, and Toronto made aware of Baldwin, even before the job was advertised. Greene himself assembled the requisite testimonials, as letters of reference were then called. In addition to letters from a number of Princeton professors, Baldwin's application included a testimonial from the famed Yale philosopher and psychologist George Trumbull Ladd. Because Baldwin was an American, however, all the testimonials, degrees, and publications would likely not have been enough in the face of Toronto's nativism if there had not been local support for him as well. In addition to McCurdy, Baldwin was favored early in the process by the principal of Knox College, William Cavan, and by James P. Sheraton, the principal of Wycliffe College, the low Anglican seminary affiliated with the university. This is somewhat surprising, as Hume was by far the more orthodox of the two contenders. Baldwin had been dabbling in experimental psychology, evolutionary theory, and other matters that might have been expected to cause uneasiness among traditional religious leaders. McCosh's and Greene's approval, however, seems to have allayed any doubts that Cavan or Sheraton might have harbored. Baldwin was also favored by President Wilson, who could see that he was easily the better qualified of the two main candidates. Despite such formidable support, however, the nativists controlled the university senate and sat at the cabinet table itself. Everyone could sense that a fight was brewing. Even though many of the principal decision-makers were away from Toronto late in the summer of 1889, debate over the applications, both public and private, began almost immediately after the August 15th deadline had passed. The opening salvo came on August 22nd in the form of a petition addressed to Minister of Education Ross, signed by no less than 70 graduates of the university, demanding that Hume be hired. Their wording was intentionally equivocal, but advancing the cause of nativism was clearly their first objective. 2 days later, Principal Sheraton of Wycliffe College sent his initial impressions of the applicants to Minister Ross from his retreat in Nova Scotia. Having discussed the matter with Principal Cavan of Knox, then in England, Sheraton wrote,
I think we were agreed that the best name yet discussed was that of Professor Baldwin. There is only one other applicant who can, I think, be considered his equal. That is Professor Seth of Dalhousie College, Halifax.
Having apparently heard about the swell of local support for Hume, Sheraton went on to warn that
his testimonials do not, to my mind, compare at all with those of Professor Seth and Baldwin. I would fear lest in the professor's chair he would merely give forth a weakened echo of Dr. Young's teaching.
We do not know Ross's exact reply, but he seems to have convinced Sheraton that Seth was a non-starter, for little more than a week later, on the 2nd of September, Sheraton wrote Ross again, abandoning Seth's cause, but reiterating his support for Baldwin. He also announced that he would be returning to Toronto in 12 days, ready for further discussions. Within days of Sheraton's return to Toronto on the 14th of September, he and Cavan met with Minister Ross to make a formal case for Baldwin. A written report summarizing their oral presentation soon followed.
We are decidedly of the opinion that among all the applicants, Professor Baldwin, according to the evidence before us, most completely possesses the qualifications indispensable to a teacher of mental science in our university. He is, so far as we are aware, the only applicant who has made a thorough, practical, and experimental study of physiological psychology, a department of philosophical inquiry which is regarded by progressive students as one of the most important and fruitful. He is evidently an original thinker in fullest sympathy with scientific research and progressive philosophy.
That same week, on the 19th of September, Premier Mowat called a meeting at which all sides of the question would be aired. The invitees included Minister Ross, Chancellor Blake, Principals Sheraton and Cavan, presumably President Wilson, and others as well. One of these others was the university's physics professor, James Loudon. Loudon had little interest in philosophy, but as the first native-born Canadian to have served on faculty, he had a strong interest in nativism. Wilson referred to him as the Mole in his private journals. As expected, Loudon presented a brief strongly supporting Hume's claims and denigrating Baldwin's education and attainments.
Hume will continue the teaching of Young's philosophy, with the additional advantage of possessing a good knowledge of psychology. Young's matured views were in harmony with those of the ablest philosophers living in England, Scotland, Germany, and France, and are the best basis for reconciling the conflicts of religion and science. With regard to Baldwin's philosophical standpoint, the written evidence points to his being of the school of Macosh. This school is held in extremely low estimation here and would drive men away to other universities.
This is a shameful kind of document, it seems to me. He just goes out of his way to downplay Baldwin's strong points and elevate Hume's weak points until he believes they counter. For example, Baldwin had put in his book as evidence of his ability to work in this area. When Loudon comes to discuss the writings of the two, he has to admit that Hume doesn't have any published writings, but he says that Hume has written term papers for professors at both Hopkins and Harvard, and that these papers have been given A's, and therefore he suggests that Baldwin's writings be presented to these very same professors and given marks.
It is something of a puzzle that Loudon, an advocate of laboratory science in the university and an early convert to evolutionary theory, would have supported Hume, a purely speculative philosopher who was suspicious of the claims of science and resistant to evolutionary theory, rather than supporting Baldwin, a man keen to extend the scientific approach to psychology and who had adopted a generally favorable view of evolutionary theory from the start.
Well, if one prioritizes Loudon's interests, I guess we should put it that way, then, I mean, I don't know if it's at the top, but one thing very close to the top would have been that we got to hire a Canadian, in particular somebody from the University of Toronto, because we want to, you know, as part of that urge towards self-determination, or whatever you want to call it. And obviously the fact that Hume was inexperienced in terms of teaching and also had no experience in terms of laboratory psychology was not a great concern to Loudon.
Principals Cavan and Sheraton presented at the same meeting a response to Loudon's rhapsodic defense of Hume.
The statement that Baldwin is of the school of McCosh is absolutely baseless. His published writings are marked by an independence of thought and show that he is in many important points akin to Lotze. Like the late Professor Young, he is idealistic, though he gives full value to the recent investigations in physiological psychology. In any case, it is preposterous to assume that the continuation of any particular type of philosophy is essential to the welfare of philosophical studies in Toronto. In German universities, the most diverse systems are taught side by side.
Sheraton and Cavan, who were the principals of Knox and Wycliffe, undertook to reply to Loudon, and they rebutted the points one by one that Loudon had made, pointing out, for example, that the referees Baldwin were just as distinguished, and not only that, but he had studied in Europe with some of the leading German professors. They point out the obvious thing about his publications and Hume's lack of them. They point out that he has successfully taught both at Princeton and at Lake Forest, and that Hume has not yet had a chance to teach at this level.
Within days, rumors began to spread that the cabinet was on the verge of hiring the American Baldwin over the homegrown Hume. As they had the previous winter, several of the city's newspapers erupted in nativist outcry.
Gosh, there was a lot of newspapers, and virtually all of them had something to say about this appointment. It became a city affair. I don't know what it could be compared to, but it was, we can't call it headlines, but it was front page stuff, if not on the editorial page, almost every day in one, if not two or three or four or five newspapers.
Less than a week after Mowat's meeting, a deputation of 37 graduates of the university, including several professors, marched to the Premier's office demanding a meeting of their own. Mowat and 3 other members of the cabinet, including Ross and Gibson, listened politely to their demands that Hume be hired. Mowat, the master politician, diffused the situation by announcing that their views would receive careful consideration and that the government would have what he called a strong leaning toward hiring a Toronto graduate. Now recognizing that the situation could become politically uncomfortable for himself, just 2 days later Mowat met privately with President Wilson, advising him to find a compromise. Wilson bristled at the suggestion, but recognized necessity and opened negotiations with the strongest nativist in cabinet, the provincial secretary, John Morrison Gibson. There was little common ground between the two men, and their discussions may well have come to nothing, had not a hitherto unrecognized solution been revealed by developments at another university. George Grant, principal of Queen's University, moved to strengthen his own school by hiring a second professor of philosophy, Samuel Walters Dyed, to work alongside Queen's established philosopher, the prominent idealist John Watson. With that, the outline of a compromise at Toronto must have become immediately obvious to Wilson and Gibson. Within 2 weeks, they had agreed that both Baldwin and Hume should be hired, Baldwin to the university chair in logic and metaphysics, and Hume to a new position in ethics and the history of philosophy. Hume would also be given 2 years to complete his Ph.D. before having to take up his teaching duties, along with a fellowship to support himself. Mowat was, no doubt, convinced to agree to this rather expensive deal by the argument that the provincial university must not be seen to fall behind its private denominational competitors, such as Queen's. Mowat had a price of his own, however. Wilson was required to write letters to local newspapers praising the wisdom and generosity of Mowat and his government in their handling of the situation. Wilson grudgingly complied, and the deal was done. In his private journal, Wilson wrote simply, "The agony is over." The nativist protests continued on and off for months, but to no avail. Baldwin quit Lake Forest in the middle of term and arrived in Toronto in November 1889 to take up his new duties. Just 3 months later, however, the university's main building burnt down. Baldwin turned the disaster into an opportunity by ensuring that the rebuilt structure included a permanent psychology laboratory, just the 12th in North America and the first in the British Empire. Baldwin repeatedly requested a laboratory demonstrator to allow him time for research, but the university just as repeatedly replied that the school could not afford one. Nevertheless, Baldwin published the second volume of his textbook, started his developmental research, and began work on the book for which he is now best known, Mental Development in the Child and Race, all during his short stint in Canada. In 1893, just as he had finally been permitted to hire an assistant out of Wundt's Leipzig laboratory, August Kirschmann, he was called to a position at Princeton. Baldwin would go on to become a significant figure in evolutionary thought and functionalist psychology, as well as a truly pivotal one in the history of developmental psychology. He was also an important figure in the founding of the American Psychological Association and the journals Psychological Review and Psychological Bulletin. Hume would take his Ph.D. in Freiburg, Germany, spending some of his time in Hugo Münsterberg's psychology laboratory. He wrote his dissertation, however, on political economy and ethics, under the supervision of Alois Riel. With Baldwin's departure, Hume became the sole professor of philosophy at the university, but his impact on the field was practically nil. He published little, and most of what he did publish appeared only locally. His writings consisted mainly of idealist critiques of psychology and evolutionary theory, investigations prompted by student complaints about his teaching. He was effectively forcibly retired in 1926 after heading the department for over 30 years.